The winter of 1847 pressed its cold breath across the Ohio River Valley, settling over Milbrook, Kentucky like a heavy wool shroud. Snow muffled the narrow streets, but whispers traveled faster than the wind. In the heart of town, beneath the stately facade of the Sullivan Medical Institute, investigators had found something that would stain Milbrook's name for generations. Beneath polished floors and respectable halls lay a network of hidden chambers, cold, silent, and lined with glass containers. Inside them were the preserved remains of more than 60 men, women, and children who had vanished over the past 15 years. Their bodies, eerily intact, stood as mute witnesses to something the townsfolk could hardly imagine. Discovery alone was horrifying, but the accompanying journals pushed it into the realm of nightmare. Bound in worn leather and inked in a precise, almost elegant hand, Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's notes detailed medical procedures no sane mind would attempt on the living. Many of the victims had walked through his doors seeking help for ailments so trivial they seemed almost laughable: no mild headaches, nervous sleep, indigestion, and yet Sullivan's so-called cures had spiraled into invasive, radical experiments. When the Kentucky State Medical Board reviewed the evidence, they locked the full report away in sealed archives. For nearly 2 centuries, those pages would remain hidden, leaving only fragments of the truth to drift through history. Back then, before his name became synonymous with horror, Dr. Sullivan was the pride of Milbrook. The town itself sat like a forgotten gem on a quiet bend of the Ohio River, where steamboats paused to take on loads of tobacco and grain bound for New Orleans. Founded in 1823, Milbrook was a place of hard work and deep roots. Its 800 or so residents were farmers, merchants, and river hands who had carved out steady, respectable lives in the fertile bottomlands. The locals boasted about their proud brick courthouse, the Methodist church whose steeple pierced the sky higher than anything for 50 miles, and most of all the gleaming Medical Institute on Main Street. When Sullivan arrived in 1831, he seemed like a man from another world. In his early 40s, with silver streaking his dark hair and an air of polished authority, he carried credentials from the finest medical colleges in Philadelphia and Edinburgh. His luggage contained surgical tools so finely made that most frontier doctors would never even see their like, and his shelves groaned under the weight of imported medical texts. Within months, he had established the Sullivan Medical Institute, a grand 3-story brick building with private patient rooms, a state-of-the-art surgical theater, and a basement he described as a research laboratory. His methods dazzled the community. Where traveling physicians clung to bloodletting and purging, Sullivan spoke of direct neural intervention and anatomical investigation. To those who came to him with hopeless cases, he offered miracles. Chronic pain melted away, fevers broke, minds tormented by unseen disturbances calmed, and yet, behind every recovery, there were patterns no one was looking for, at least, not yet. Sullivan lived in quiet isolation in the rooms above the institute, accompanied by his teenage daughter, Margaret, a pale, withdrawn girl who rarely mingled in town. The doctor claimed his wife had perished in a yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans, and that his relentless dedication to medicine was born from the helplessness of watching her die. The town admired this devotion. They respected his grief. No one questioned why many of Sullivan's miracles involved patients from faraway counties, drifters, laborers, solitary souls, people whose absence would raise no alarm. The first crack in his perfect facade appeared in October of 1846. Thomas Rist, a respected tobacco merchant, walked into Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael's office with a tremor in his voice. His younger brother Robert had been suffering since a fall from a horse earlier that year. Sullivan had promised occurred 2 weeks of treatment at the institute. That was 6 weeks ago. Every time I ask about him, Thomas said, hands shaking, the doctor claims the treatment's going well, but I'm not allowed to see Robert. He says family interference could ruin the process. Sheriff Carmichael had known the Riss family for decades. The explanation sat ill with him. The next morning, under a grey November sky, he paid an unannounced visit to the institute. Sullivan was as composed as ever. Seated at his desk, reading patient files by lamplight, he spoke smoothly, reassuring the sheriff that Robert was in delicate condition, far too fragile for visitors. The mind, Sheriff, he said, is a fragile instrument. We must recalibrate it with precision. But Carmichael's attention had drifted to the hallway beyond the half-open door. Margaret was there, mopping the floor near the basement stairs. The water in her bucket was tinged a rusty brown. A sharp, chemical smell hung in the air, struggling to mask something darker, the faint, unmistakable odor of decay. That night, Carmichael returned alone. The building was dark except for a faint glow in the basement windows. Circling to the back, he found a low window and peered inside. What he saw routed him to the spot. In the narrow circle of lamplight, Sullivan stood over an examination table, a blood-stained leather apron tied around his waist. He was making precise incisions into what was undeniably human flesh. Glass containers filled with preserved organs lined the shelves. Beyond them, in the dim shadows, more tables each draped with a white sheet over a still form. One of them, Carmichael realized with a jolt, had the unmistakable red hair and broad build of Robert H.R. by morning. Word had spread through Milbrook like a prairie fire, but instead of outrage, Carmichael encountered resistance, doubt, even scorn. "Thomas Riss has been drinking since his brother went missing," whispered Mrs. Adelaide Prescott, wife of the banker, "and the sheriff's been itching to challenge Dr. Sullivan ever since that cholera dispute last summer." When the hastily assembled town council confronted Sullivan, the doctor seemed almost hurt by the accusations. He admitted that he kept cadavers in his basement purchased, he claimed, from medical schools in Louisville for the sake of anatomical research. Robert, he said gravely, had died from a sudden brain fever. The body had been preserved to allow for further study that might save others. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady and heavy with apparent sorrow, "if my methods seem unconventional, it is because conventional medicine has failed too many." In the end, the council allowed him to continue practicing under increased oversight. They required detailed records of every patient. Sullivan agreed without hesitation. The public saw cooperation. Carmichael saw a man buying himself time. The sheriff began digging. Between 1832 and 1846, 37 people had entered the institute for extended treatment. 14 had returned, 23 were said to have died, but most were outsiders. Their deaths reported by letter to families who never saw the bodies. Sullivan's accounts showed purchases of surgical equipment and chemicals far beyond a rural doctor's needs. His correspondence hinted at networks stretching from Louisville to Baltimore. As the winter of 1847 deepened, more families arrived with the same story. A loved one had gone to Dr. Sullivan and had simply vanished, and Sheriff Carmichael realized with a chill this was only the beginning. Snow still clung to the edges of Milbrook's cobblestone streets, but Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael's mind was fixed on things far darker than the lingering winter. Ever since that night, since the glimpse through Dr. Sullivan's basement window, he'd been chasing threads that kept leading to the same shadowy pattern. Families from beyond Milbrook began arriving in twos and threes, each carrying the same look, hope bruised into grief, questions gnawing at their voices, and each carried a story that sounded hauntingly familiar. The first to come was Samuel Turner, a weather-worn riverboat captain from Madison, Indiana. His son David had been lost in a fog of despair since his fiancée drowned the year before. Turner had tried prayer, doctors, and time, but nothing seemed to reach the boy. Then came an advertisement in the Madison Courier: revolutionary treatments for disorders of the mind and nervous system, private residential care, latest European methods. It had Sullivan's name printed in bold. David wrote home once after arriving in August 1845. The letter claimed treatment was going well, that more time was needed. Turner made the journey to Milbrook 3 times after that. Each visit ended with the same smile from Sullivan, the same calm assurance that David was on the cusp of recovery, but not ready for visitors. On his last visit, the doctor told him David had been sent to a specialized facility in Louisville. Turner checked every hospital, every asylum in the city. No one had ever heard of his son. Then came Ellen Dawson from Bardstown, her black dress dusted with the long road's dirt. She had sent her 16-year-old daughter, Catherine, to Sullivan for fainting spells and headaches the other doctors had waved away as female hysteria. For a while, letters arrived. Catherine said she was improving, that she was learning about anatomy and might even assist the doctor. But Ellen knew her daughter, Catherine, fainted at the sight of a butcher's shop. She could no more assist in surgery than she could lift an anvil. And then, the letters stopped. The stories piled up, each with the same unsettling rhythm, a hopeful departure. Early letters full of progress, the slow, deliberate silence. And finally, a letter from Sullivan, always Sullivan, announcing death or a transfer to a place no one could find. Carmichael began charting names and dates. Over 14 years, the map of disappearances spread like spilled ink across Kentucky, Indiana, and southern Ohio. He saw the pattern clearly. Sullivan targeted people far enough away that no one could make frequent visits, and desperate enough to agree to extended stays without question. Worse still, Carmichael discovered that Sullivan's reach wasn't just in letters and word of. The man was advertising far beyond the valley, small columns in city papers from Cincinnati to Evansville, promising hope to those whom conventional medicine had abandoned on, always the promise, private treatment in a fully equipped medical institute. February arrived with a biting wind that scraped along the Ohio. That was when Carmichael decided half measures were done. If Sullivan had a trap laid in that basement, he meant to walk into it with backup. He called on Deputy James Whitfield, a quiet man with a soldier's patience, and Dr. Augustus Brennan, a retired Army surgeon who had lately settled in Milbrook. Brennan had already voiced suspicions about Sullivan's methods, muttering over drinks that progressive medicine could easily hide something darker. They chose a moonless night. Midnight found them at the Institute's back service door, the one Carmichael had unlocked with a key borrowed from the building's original contractor. The first step inside was like entering another world. The air was thick, sour with formaldehyde, yet under it lay a damp, organic rot. Every board beneath their boots bore faint stains that had resisted scrubbing, and somewhere below, faint but clear, came the scrape of metal, the clink of glass, and God help them, voices. They moved first through the ground floor patient rooms. Brennan stopped at one and ran his hand along the wall. Iron shackles, bolted in. The windows were barred from the outside. The beds fitted with thick leather straps too heavy for any medical restraint. These aren't recovery rooms, Brennan murmured. They're cells. In Sullivan's office, Carmichael found a locked cabinet. Inside were files, dozens of them each, a meticulous record, each with more than just medical notes. There were anatomical sketches, measurements, and descriptions of procedures that stripped away any illusion of healing. Robert Friss's file ran to 17 pages, detailing operations performed while he was awake, notes on which parts of his brain reacted to pressure, how his speech faltered when certain areas were stimulated. But one file stopped Carmichael cold. Margaret Sullivan, not assistant, not daughter. In these pages she was Subject M, the primary research assistant, subjected to experimental procedures since childhood. Surgical diagrams showed scars, notes on chemical treatments, and chilling plans for future modifications. Brennan's knuckles whitened around the papers. A narrow staircase, hidden behind a bookshelf, led them downward. The smell thickened, metallic and sweet all at once. The basement opened into a labyrinth of rooms. The first was a surgical chamber, 4 tables, each fitted with restraints. The walls bloomed with anatomical charts, human bodies cut into numbered sections. A preservation room held glass cylinders, 43 of them each, cradling human organs suspended in cloudy liquid. Dates and initials clung to the jars like labels in some Macabre museum. But the worst was a smaller chamber set apart from the rest. 12 human heads floated in separate tanks, faces preserved with unnatural clarity. Brennan leaned close to one. That's David Turner. His voice was a whisper stripped of all emotion. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sullivan entered, lamp in hand, apron stained with a day's work. Behind him, Margaret, moving with a precision too mechanical to be natural, closed off the exit. Gentlemen, Sullivan said, as though greeting dinner guests. I had hoped curiosity could be managed in more civilized ways. He spoke as though they'd come for a lecture, pacing among his instruments. Everything you see here, he said, will advance medicine beyond imagination. Each patient, each volunteer has contributed to discoveries that will save untold lives. Whitfield's voice cut through. They trusted you. Sullivan's eyes lit with something close to joy, and what trust it was. Cadavers teach us nothing of the living body, but a conscious subject, knowledge to be gained. He gestured to Margaret. Without hesitation, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing a crosshatch of scars. Sullivan drew a scalpel and sliced a long one. She didn't flinch. Through careful nerve modification, he said, she no longer feels pain, nor does she suffer from empathy, a most inconvenient trait in medicine. Margaret spoke in a voice as steady as a metronome. Temporary discomfort was necessary to optimize my function. Whitfield's eyes swept the room and stopped. Beyond a curtain, 6 patients lay strapped to tables. Their heads were shaved, incisions stitched in neat lines. Eyes followed the intruders with desperate clarity, but not one could speak. Vocal cords, Carmichael guessed, deliberately damaged. Sullivan followed his gaze, almost proudly. My current studies. One gentleman has not slept in 3 weeks. Promising results, though cognition suffers. Another, he touched a young woman's chart, has had her anxiety responses removed. I'm close to a breakthrough. Brennan's jaw tightened. You've turned them into prisoners. Subjects, Sullivan corrected. And you, gentlemen, could be invaluable additions to my work. That was when Carmichael knew the only way out tonight was through a fight. Margaret moved to block their path. Sullivan's hand hovered over a tray of gleaming instruments. The air was heavy with the metallic tamps of blood and chemicals, and the sheriff thought, with a shudder, that the horror of Milbrook had only just shown its face. Margaret stood at the foot of the stairs, her pale face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Behind her, the heavy door to the basement shut with a slow, final click. The air felt tighter. Sullivan's shadow stretched across the room, long and sharp, like a blade. "You've seen more than you were meant to," the doctor said, not with anger, but with the weary patience of a teacher correcting errant pupils. "But knowledge, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. That makes you dangerous." Sheriff Carmichael's eyes swept the room, mapping exits, weighing the space between them and the armed, efficient figure of Margaret. Deputy Whitfield's stance shifted, readying for a fight, while Dr. Brennan's gaze remained locked on the 6 living captives beyond the curtain. Sullivan strolled between the tables, letting his fingers trace the cold steel restraints as if he were a conductor poised. "To begin a symphony, you see victims," he said softly. "I see milestones in human understanding. Do you know what it means to chart the exact neural pathway of grief? To observe the living brain as it abandons fear? We stand at the frontier of human evolution." Whitfield's voice came steady. "Cold, you stand at the gallows." Sullivan chuckled low, almost fond. "Ah, but progress has always been misunderstood. Those who feared the scalpel once feared the printing press too." Without warning, Margaret moved, not fast in the jerking way of panic, but in smooth, calculated arcs. Her left hand closed around a long-handled bone saw. Her right hovered over a tray of scalpels. The sound of the metal shifting against metal was deliberate, meant to unnerve. "Father," she asked, her tone as flat as her gaze, "contain them." Sullivan replied, as though ordering a nurse to fetch linens. Carmichael lunged first, aiming to force her aside and reach the stairway. But Margaret pivoted, low and quick, her saw slicing the air inches from his arm. Whitfield moved to back him, but Sullivan stepped in with surprising speed, using a clamp like a weapon, its jaws snapping shut against Whitfield's sleeve. Brennan, unarmed but driven by a soldier's reflexes, grabbed a stool and swung. The impact glanced off Margaret's shoulder. She neither winced nor stumbled. Instead, she advanced, her movements efficient, stripped of all hesitation, proof of her father's years of conditioning. A moan broke from one of the captives. It was faint, strangled by damaged vocal cords, but it was enough to drag Brennan's attention toward the curtained chamber. "Help me," the voice, thin as paper, belonged to the young woman in the far corner, her chart marked N61, Catherine, even with the stitches along her scalp. Her eyes burned with unmistakable clarity. Brennan moved toward her, but Sullivan's voice rang out like a command in an operating theater. "She is my long-term subject. 8 months of progressive modification. Do not touch her." Whitfield broke free from Sullivan's grasp, shoving the doctor into a cabinet with enough force to send glass jars crashing to the floor. The acrid smell of chemicals bloomed in the air. Margaret reacted instantly, swinging the bone saw toward Whitfield's ribs, but Carmichael intercepted, grappling her arm. Her strength was unnatural for her size, not wild but measured, every movement aimed to disable rather than kill. "She feels nothing," Sullivan called, regaining his footing. "No fear, no hesitation, no pain. She is the future of medical assistance." Brennan reached Catherine's table and began unbuckling the restraints. Her muscles trembled violently when he tried to help her sit up. Modifications had stolen her coordination. Still, she met his gaze with raw urgency. "Others," she mouthed, her lips shaping the word without sound. Brennan looked beyond 5 more captives, each in varying states of surgical ruin. One man's head was swathed in fresh bandages. Another woman's chest bore stitched incisions where no treatment belonged. Margaret's arm twisted under Carmichael's grip, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she shifted her weight suddenly, sending both of them crashing against the preservation tanks. One cylinder tipped. Its cloudy contents spilled across the floor, carrying with it the pale, bloated form of a human liver. The captives reacted with widened eyes, others with desperate, muffled noises. The sharp chemical stink intensified, burning in their nostrils. Whitfield took advantage of the chaos. He seized a heavy tray from the instrument stand and swung it toward Sullivan. The metal caught him across the temple. The doctor staggered but didn't fall. Blood ran down his cheek, and yet his eyes glittered with something dangerously close to joy. "You think," Sullivan said through shallow breaths, "you can stop this by brute force? My notes are complete. My methods will live on." Brennan had freed Catherine entirely now, but she collapsed into his arms, unable to stand. He looked to Carmichael. "We can't carry them all without help." The sheriff's gaze flicked to the hidden door they'd used to enter. "We get the living out first, then come back for the rest." Margaret lunged again, this time toward Brennan, her scalpel glinting. Carmichael intercepted, tackling her to the floor. Even pinned, she didn't resist like a struggling person. Every motion was deliberate, aimed at joint locks and pressure points. Sullivan grabbed for another instrument, this one long and thin, its point wickedly sharp. Whitfield stepped between him and the captives, and the two men collided with a force that rattled the tables. The doctor fought with the precision of someone used to handling delicate tools, but Whitfield's raw strength drove him back against the surgical table. A glass jar toppled, shattering, and a preserved human hand tumbled to the floor between them. The moans of the captives grew louder, some in panic, others in the throes of pain as the cold air hit their surgical wounds. Brennan scooped Catherine up and moved toward the stairs, his boots slipping in the chemical slick. Carmichael forced Margaret's arm behind her back, his other hand pressing her face to the floor. Her breathing remained steady, no sign of panic, no rush of adrenaline. "She's not going to stop," he gritted to Whitfield. "We need to move now." Sullivan's voice rose behind them, part fury, part sermon. "You are destroying decades of research. You have no idea the advancements these subjects have made possible." Whitfield's answer was to drive his fist into the doctor's midsection, doubling him over. The deputy grabbed a length of surgical restraint from the nearest table and lashed Sullivan's wrists together. With Catherine in Brennan's arms, they began the retreat. Carmichael shoved Margaret toward a corner and bound her hands with another restraint strap. Even as she stood there, her eyes tracked their movements, calculating, memorizing. "You'll come back," she said softly, not a threat, not a plea, a statement. That they reached the stairs. The air above felt cleaner, but not by much. The smell of chemicals clung to them like oil. Behind them, the muffled sound of Sullivan's voice carried upward, still preaching the righteousness of his work. Even as he sat bound among the wreckage of his lab at the top of the stairs, Carmichael paused, looking back into the shadows. Below there were still 5 captives strapped to tables, still rooms they hadn't searched, still horrors they hadn't uncovered, but they had Catherine, and that was a start. Outside, the winter night felt almost warm by comparison. The street was silent, the snow untouched. Brennan shifted Catherine's weight in his arms. Her eyes were open, fixed on the darkness behind them. "They're still down there," she whispered, the words almost lost in the wind. Carmichael nodded, his jaw tight, and were going back for them. The wind cut across Milbrook's main street as Sheriff Carmichael, Deputy Whitfield, and Dr. Brennan half carried, half led Catherine toward the sheriff's office. Every step felt heavier, not from her weight, but from the knowing knowledge of who they'd left behind in Sullivan's basement. Inside, they laid her gently on the cot in the back room. The lamplight caught the pale lines of the surgical stitches along her scalp. She winced at the brightness, but her eyes never left. "Carmichael's, they can't move," she rasped. "The others, they're alive, but they can't move." Brennan's jaw set. "She's right. The longer we wait, the less chance they have." Whitfield fetched blankets, but Catherine flinched at the touch, her muscles jerking involuntarily. "He's been changing the way we feel things," she whispered. "Pain, fear, even how we sleep," I heard him say. "Some of us are experiments he'll never finish." Carmichael looked to Brennan. "We can't handle this alone. Not if Sullivan fights the way he just did, and not with Margaret." Brennan nodded grimly. "We'll need more men, and they'll have to be ready to see things they'll never forget." By dawn, the sheriff had gathered a small, hand-picked group, 5 men he trusted from neighboring towns, all with steady nerves and strong stomachs. Each was armed, not just with pistols and shotguns, but with thick ropes and crowbars. The plan was simple in theory: secure the Institute, rescue the captives, and bring Sullivan and Margaret out under guard. But Carmichael knew there was nothing simple about walking back into that place. They reached the building just after noon. Its brick walls looked almost inviting under the winter sun, a mask of respectability over the truth below. Whitfield forced the rear service door open. The same sour cocktail of chemicals and rot rolled out to meet them. The men exchanged glances, even without knowing the basement's secrets. The smell alone would have set them on edge. Inside, the ground floor felt like a place abandoned mid-step. Patient rooms stood in neat order, the beds still made, but the air was heavy with stillness. Brennan checked one and found a metal tray laid out with instruments, each gleaming as though freshly polished, waiting. Carmichael led them toward the hidden staircase behind the bookshelf in Sullivan's office. The path down was narrow, steep, and reeking of formaldehyde. At the base, the basement opened before them like the gut of some great beast. The surgical suite was as they'd left it, for tables, restraints at the ready, anatomical charts lining the walls, but the preservation room had changed. Several of the glass containers were gone, leaving wet circles where they'd once stood, where the hell Whitfield began, but stopped. From somewhere deeper, voices drifted low, urgent. They found Sullivan in the neurological chamber, seated at one of the examination tables with a journal open in front of him. His wrists were no longer bound. Beside him stood Margaret, her hands steady as she adjusted the straps on one of the captives. "You've returned," Sullivan said, as though they'd simply resumed a paused conversation. "Good, there's still much to see." Two of the armed men stepped forward, raising their rifles. "Step away from the table," one barked. Sullivan didn't move. "You could take these patients away." "Yes, but without my intervention, they will die. Their conditions are delicate." Carmichael's gaze swept the room. Catherine's warning had been truth. The 5 remaining captives lay strapped in place, their eyes tracking every movement. One man's breath rattled faintly. Another's chest rose in shallow, uneven pools. "We're taking them," Carmichael said. "Then you will kill them," Sullivan replied evenly. "Their survival depends on my continued work." Brennan stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Your work is the reason they're like this." Margaret moved to intercept, positioning herself between the rescuers and the tables. The precision of her stance was military, her expression unreadable. "You'll have to get through me," she said. Whitfield shifted his rifle toward her move. "Margaret, don't make us hurt you." "You can't hurt me," she replied. Simply. One of the armed men, a farmer named Harlan, stepped toward the nearest captive, a young man with his head swathed in clean bandages. As he leaned in to check the restraints, the man's lips moved soundlessly, eyes pleading for something none of them could give in that moment. Harlan began unbuckling the straps. That was when Margaret struck. Her movement was a blur one moment, standing still, the next wrenching the rifle from Harlan's grip and swinging the butt into his chest. He staggered back, wheezing. The room erupted into chaos. Brennan shoved past to reach the captive, while Whitfield grappled with Margaret. Carmichael lunged for Sullivan, who had stepped toward a nearby table of instruments. The doctor fought, with cold efficiency, jabbing with forceps, slashing with a scalpel, but Carmichael had the weight advantage. He slammed Sullivan against the wall, the thud echoing through the chamber. Meanwhile, Margaret twisted free from Whitfield, using a kick to send one of the other men sprawling. She reached for a surgical clamp, but Brennan caught her wrist and slammed it against the table, the metal clattering to the floor. "Bind her tight," Carmichael ordered. It took 2 men to restrain her. Even then, she didn't struggle like someone in pain. She simply adjusted her weight, testing the bonds. Her breathing remained slow and measured. Sullivan watched, a faint smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "She will outlast you all," he murmured. The rescuers moved quickly, unbuckling each of the remaining captives. Their conditions varied. One could sit upright with help, another could barely move at all. 2 were so weak that Brennan feared moving them might kill them. But there was no choice. They formed a grim procession toward the stairs, 2 men carrying each of the most fragile. Brennan and Whitfield supporting the others. Carmichael stayed behind with 2 riflemen to guard Sullivan and Margaret. As the last of the captives was carried up, Sullivan spoke again, his voice low but cutting through the thick air. "You've interrupted a process you don't understand. Do you know what this means? My research unfinished. Do you think anyone else will care for them? Do you think they will survive without me?" Carmichael met his gaze. "Better they die free than live in your hands." The group emerged into daylight, the pale sun hitting their faces like a baptism. Onlookers had begun to gather in the street, drawn by the unusual sight of armed men carrying limp, bandaged figures out of the most respected building in town. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman gasped when she recognized one of the captives as her cousin, missing for nearly a year. By the time the last captive was brought out, the air in the basement felt thinner, as though some of the horror had seeped away with their departure. Sullivan and Margaret were led up in chains, their expressions calm, almost serene. "This is not the end," Sullivan said, as they stepped into the light. "Ideas do not die with men." But for the first time in 15 years, the basement of the Sullivan Medical Institute was empty of the living. Carmichael looked back at the building's dark windows, thinking of the preserved jars, the anatomical charts, the endless journals. Empty, yes, but the ghosts would remain. By the following morning, the quiet town of Milbrook felt like the center of the state. Riders came in before dawn, bearing messages to Frankfurt, Louisville, and Cincinnati. By noon, wagons clattered up Main Street carrying men in long coats and heavy boots, state marshals, county officials, and physicians summoned to make sense of the nightmare beneath the Sullivan Medical Institute. The captives had been moved to the Methodist Church, where the pews had been cleared to make space for rows of cots. The building smelled of boiled linens and antiseptic instead of incense. Local women moved between the beds, spooning broth into unsteady mouths, dabbing at foreheads beaded with fever. Sheriff Carmichael stood at the door, intercepting each new arrival. "No gawkers," he repeated for the 10th time. "This isn't a spectacle." But the crowd still pressed in, murmuring, pointing half in horror, half in disbelief. In Sullivan's former office, state officials spread maps and documents. Across his desk, ledgers, letters, and thick journals, bound in worn leather, lay open under the lamplight. Dr. Augustus Brennan sat among them, turning the pages with a grim, deliberate hand. "These aren't just medical notes," he said at last. "They're records, case files, 17 years' worth." Each file told the same story in cold, methodical detail: name, ailment, dates of treatment, and surgical procedures written in Sullivan's exacting hand. There were anatomical diagrams, annotated with his observations. Some entries had sketches so precise they looked more like blueprints than drawings of human bodies. One by one, they began matching the names to missing persons reports from across Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, and beyond. By dusk, they had a count: 89 victims. The youngest was 14, the oldest, 67. A clerk from Frankfort, pale and sweating, whispered as he added the final tally. "This isn't just Milbrook's shame. This is everywhere." The following day, a team descended into the basement under official guard. It took hours to document each room, each preserved specimen, each surgical table. The preservation chamber held its own grim inventory. 43 glass containers with organs labeled only by initials and dates. Brennan stood over one of them, the cloudy liquid distorting the shape inside. He catalogued everything, he said, like a man who believed he was building a library. The neurological chamber proved worse. The 12 preserved heads stared from their jars with expressions frozen at the moment of death, some peaceful, some contorted in pain. Labels matched them to names Carmichael had heard from weeping relatives the day before: David Turner, Catherine Dawson, others whose families had waited years for news. Never imagining it would come like this, a young marshal bent over one jar and recoiled, gagging. "How could a man look at this and not lose his mind?" Brennan answered without looking up. He didn't lose his mind. He surrendered it piece by piece until this seemed reasonable to him. Margaret Sullivan was kept in a guarded cell at the sheriff's office. Her demeanor unsettled even the most seasoned lawmen. She spoke in precise, measured sentences, never raising her voice, never showing fear or anger. When asked about the captives, she recited procedures in the same tone one might use to list ingredients for a recipe. "Pain is counterproductive to efficient surgery," she explained at one point, her eyes fixed on the wall. "Father removed my capacity for it when I was 8. Later, he adjusted my emotional responses. Sympathy interferes with objectivity." The men guarding her took turns, none willing to be alone with her for long. Sullivan himself remained under constant watch. In the adjoining cell, he filled every hour with writing, scratching page after page in a cramped, flowing script. When questioned, he answered with the confidence of a man convinced of his own righteousness. "You think me a monster," he told Carmichael during one of the sheriff's visits. "But I have seen into the human machine in ways no one else dares. These people, these volunteers, have given themselves to history. One day your descendants will thank me." Carmichael leaned against the bars. "History's going to remember you, all right, but not the way you think." Word spread quickly beyond Milbrook. Reporters arrived from Louisville and Lexington, sketching the Institute's facade, scribbling notes as they spoke to townspeople. Some printed accounts painted Sullivan as a brilliant but misguided visionary. Others called him a butcher hiding behind a doctor's coat. Relatives of the dead and missing began arriving in waves. Some collapsed in grief upon hearing the details. Others demanded to see the basement themselves, as though their eyes would confirm what their minds refused to believe. The town council barred the public from entering, but the decision did little to calm the fury simmering in the streets. A week into the investigation, a new layer emerged. Among Sullivan's correspondence were letters to and from other physicians' men in Nashville, Lexington, and Louisville. The tone of these exchanges was polite, almost collegial, but the content was troubling. Sullivan described neurological optimization techniques and progressive anatomical interventions. without explaining exactly how his results were achieved. Brennan studied one letter, his brow furrowed. Either these men didn't care to ask, or they already knew. State officials took the letters seriously. By the week's end, they had dispatched investigators to the other addresses. What they found hinted that Sullivan might not have been an isolated case at all. In the church, Catherine Dawson began speaking in longer sentences, though her voice remained a strained whisper. She described months of surgeries while awake, Sullivan asking her to report sensations as he worked. When she cried, he told her emotion was a malfunction that could be corrected. Brennan wrote down every word. Her testimony, along with that of the other survivors, would become the backbone of the case against Sullivan. That night, Carmichael walked home past the Institute. Its windows were dark, but in the dim moonlight, the brick still seemed to hold the memory of light. Glowing from its basement, he thought of the people who had entered through its front door, believing they would leave healed. Some had, but most had left only in glass jars or on stretched white sheets. He stopped at the corner and looked back one last time. The building stood silent, but the weight of what had been found inside pressed against the air like an unspoken curse. The real work had only begun. The files had to be catalogued, the victims identified, the networks uncovered, and still, Carmichael knew, there were questions even Sullivan's meticulous records wouldn't answer. Questions about how a man becomes what Sullivan had become, and whether others were already walking the same path. 2 weeks after the rescue, the walls of Milbrook's small sheriff's office were lined with boxes of evidence: Sullivan's journals, patient files, letters, and ledgers. Each day, state officials carried more away to Frankfurt for cataloging, but still, the piles seemed endless. Sheriff Carmichael had thought the worst of the work was over. He was wrong. The letters in Sullivan's possession revealed names, other physicians, other towns, other specialists who shared his interest in neurological enhancement and progressive surgical study. The first to draw attention was Dr. Edmund Forrester of Nashville. Sullivan's correspondence with him stretched back nearly a decade, filled with discussions about preservation methods, subject recruitment, and equipment orders far beyond what a small private practice would need. When marshals raided Forrester's practice, they found preserved human organs stored in basement cabinets, alongside notebooks describing post-mortem examinations. But some entries suggested procedures had been performed on living patients. One jar held a human brain suspended in liquid. A date was scrawled on the label, 3 days before death. Next came Dr. William Chandler of Lexington. His letters from Sullivan were more guarded, but hinted at a shared fascination with emotional recalibration through targeted cranial intervention. Chandler's patient records told their own story and unusually high mortality rate among those treated for minor complaints. By the time investigators arrived, Chandler was dead, collapsed in his study from what his coroner called a massive cardiac event. His surviving notes were fragmented, but one sketch showed a diagram of the human brain marked with surgical entry points, eerily similar to Sullivan's own charts. The most unsettling discovery was Dr. Harrison Blackstone of Louisville. His private hospital had a reputation for discretion, attracting patients from across Kentucky and Indiana for treatment of nervous disorders. Sullivan's letters to Blackstone were almost casual in tone, as though between friends who understood each other's work without needing to state the obvious. In one, Sullivan praised Blackstone's amygdala procedure for producing consistent emotional dampening without impairing motor skill. When investigators entered Blackstone's hospital, they found no basement jars or crude restraints. Instead, they uncovered surgical logs detailing multiple cranial interventions on patients who had been admitted for nothing more serious than insomnia or anxiety. Most of the patients had died. The families had been assured it was due to unrelated medical complications. By mid-March, the pattern was undeniable. Sullivan was not alone, whether by direct instruction, casual correspondence, or shared ideology. He had been part of a small but dangerous circle of physicians pushing the boundaries of medical ethics and stepping well past them. The press seized on the phrase, "medical network of butchers." In Milbrook, the townspeople watched uneasily as outsiders arrived: reporters, lawyers, grieving relatives. Some came for answers, others came for vengeance. One bitter morning, Samuel Turner stood in the church doorway, his breath steaming in the cold. His son David's preserved head had been identified in Sullivan's basement. Turner's hands shook as he spoke to Carmichael. "There are others like him," Turner said. "We can't just put this one man to the rope and call it done. We have to burn it out of the roots." Carmichael agreed. But even as he said so, he knew rooting it out meant walking deeper into shadows that stretched far beyond Milbrook. Margaret Sullivan was questioned repeatedly by state investigators. Her answers were precise, her tone never wavering. She confirmed that her father had been in regular contact with colleagues who shared his commitment to advancing human understanding. They differed in methodology, she said once, but their goals aligned. Father considered them fellow pioneers. When asked if she had ever met these men, she nodded. Dr. Blackstone attended our home twice. He and father discussed patient responses for several hours. I prepared tea. Her face betrayed nothing, as though she were recounting an afternoon of polite conversation rather than a meeting of men who carved into human brains. The state's lead prosecutor, Henry Vance, saw opportunity in Margaret's calm. She's dangerous, he told Carmichael privately, but she's also a map. If we can keep her talking, she may point us to every one of them. But Brennan disagreed. She's as much a creation of her father's experiments as any of his victims. I doubt she understands right from wrong in the way we do. She'll give you facts, but not the whole picture, never the conscience behind it. Meanwhile, Sullivan himself seemed to thrive on the attention. In court hearings, he spoke at length about the limitations of conventional medicine and the need for bold inquiry. Reporters noted his steady voice and polished manners, a stark contrast to the grotesque evidence catalogued by the prosecution. I am not a criminal, he declared in one session. I am a scientist. History will vindicate. The suffering endured in my care will spare untold millions in the centuries to come. Families of his victims shouted him down, their grief spilling into rage. One woman had to be restrained after lunging at him from the gallery. Brennan, spending more time with the rescued captives, began to realize the scale of what they had endured. Many could not walk without assistance. Some would never speak again. A few remained trapped in their own bodies, their minds aware but unable to command their limbs, their living proof. Brennan told Vance that his so-called advancements are nothing but torture dressed in the language of science, but proving it to a jury would require more than pity. It would require dismantling. Sullivan's defense that his patients had consented to treatment. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer the shape of the network became, not a formal organization, but a loose constellation of men bound by ambition, secrecy, and a shared disdain for medical law. They traded ideas through letters, publications, and occasional private visits. Some, like Blackstone, hid their crimes behind the facade of respectable institutions. Others, like Chandler, worked in relative isolation, leaving few traces except for a pattern of inexplicable patient deaths. And at the center, or perhaps simply the most reckless, stood Cornelius Sullivan. One evening, as Carmichael and Whitfield walked home from the sheriff's office, the deputy asked a question that had been sitting between them for weeks. How many more do you think there are? Carmichael didn't answer right away. He thought of Sullivan's smirk, Margaret's steady eyes, the other doctor's journals. More than we'll ever know, he said finally. By April, indictments had been issued for Forrester and Blackstone. Chandler's death closed his file. Though investigators continued to comb through his notes for connections, Milbrook, once a quiet river town, had become a place people spoke of in hushed tones. Its name appeared in headlines across the country, tied forever to the revelations spilling from the Sullivan case. Carmichael sometimes walked past the now-boarded doors of the Sullivan Medical Institute. Even stripped of its contents, the building seemed to radiate its history, as if the walls themselves remembered every scream, every whispered plea, every click of the surgeon's scalpel. And he knew the real question wasn't whether the network had been broken, it was whether the rest of it had simply gone deeper underground. The trial of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan began on a rain-slicked morning in early May. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were already crowded, reporters jostling for position, grieving families clutching photographs, and townsfolk drawn by a morbid curiosity they could not admit aloud. Inside, the atmosphere was taut as wire. 12 jurors sat stiff-backed in their chairs, each wearing an expression that suggested they knew the gravity of what they had been chosen to judge. At the front, Sullivan stood beside his attorney, impeccably dressed, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, as though this were a medical lecture rather than the trial of his life. Sheriff Carmichael took a seat behind the prosecution's table, his hat in his hands. Beside him sat Dr. Augustus Brennan, flipping through a folder of medical reports. The state's opening statement, delivered by prosecutor Henry Vance, was blunt and deliberate. For 17 years, Vance began, the defendant used his position as a trusted physician to prey on the vulnerable. He promised cures to the desperate. He wrote letters to their families assuring progress, and all the while, in the basement of his institute, he performed experiments so cruel so calculated, that they defy comparison to anything in our laws, turned toward Sullivan. This was not medicine. It was methodical, and repeated 89 times. The defense, led by a sharp-eyed man named Malcolm Reeve, painted a different picture. Sullivan, he argued, was a pioneer. His work, though unconventional, was driven by pure scientific curiosity and a relentless desire to push the boundaries of medical knowledge. History, Reeve told the jury, is full of men condemned in their own time for daring to challenge what was accepted. Dr. Sullivan is one such man. He did not deny that patients had died, but he insisted they had consented to experimental treatment, and that their suffering had been an unfortunate but necessary step toward greater understanding. The first witnesses were relatives of the dead mothers, brothers, husbands each, recounting how their loved ones had entered the Sullivan Institute with hope and never returned. One man, voice shaking, described the letters he had received from Sullivan, claiming his sister was nearly cured and required just a few more weeks. She was already dead when those letters were written. The jury listened in silence. Outside, the rain hammered the courthouse roof. On the third day, the prosecution called Catherine Dawson. She was thin as a shadow, her hair cropped short where surgical scars crossed her scalp. Two court officers helped her to the stand, guiding her carefully as though she might shatter. Her voice was faint, but the room leaned in to hear. "He kept me awake," she said, "sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He would ask what I felt when he touched certain places inside my head. If I cried, he said my emotions were a defect." She paused to breathe, and Vance gave her time. "He told me," she continued, "that pain was only a message in the nerves and that he could teach my body to ignore it." Her eyes flicked toward Sullivan, who met her gaze without blinking. "He didn't teach me to ignore it. He taught me to live in it." The next witness was Thomas Beckwith, the miller from Brandenburg who had survived months under scalpel. He described the first surgery as almost gentle compared to what came later. He said each time would be the last, Beckwith told the jury. But there was always another theory, another part of the brain to explore. When Vance asked if he had agreed to the procedures, Beckwith shook his head. "I agreed to treatment. I didn't agree to be carved up while awake." The defense cross-examined aggressively, pressing the survivors on details: how clearly they remembered events, whether they had signed any documents, whether Sullivan had explained his methods. Catherine answered simply, "He said he was curing me. That's all I needed to hear." Beckwith was sharper. "If a drowning man reaches for a rope," he told Reeve, "and you use it to strangle him, don't pretend he consented." Midway through the second week, the court allowed Margaret Sullivan to testify. Her presence unsettled everyone. She walked to the stand with steady, precise steps, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Under oath, she described in clinical terms how she had assisted her father restraining patients, monitoring their breathing, recording responses. She explained how her own nervous system had been modified to eliminate pain and emotional interference. "Do you understand?" Vance asked, "that what you participated in was torture?" She tilted her head slightly, as though considering an unfamiliar word. "I understand that the procedures caused distress in the subjects, but distress is not, in itself, proof of harm when the goal is medical advancement." Her statement drew a murmur from the gallery. When the defense questioned her, she described her father as methodical and dedicated. She confirmed that she had never disobeyed him. "Why not?" Reeve asked. "Because," she replied, evenly, "I have been conditioned to value scientific goals above personal feelings." Her words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. In the final week, the prosecution brought in the preserved evidence, photographs of the surgical suite, diagrams from Sullivan's journals, and the glass containers catalogued from the basement. The images were passed slowly among the jurors, some flinching as they reached the jars containing preserved heads. Dr. Brennan testified, explaining in plain terms what each procedure had done to the victims, how nerves had been severed, brain regions probed, organs removed while patients were alive. There was no therapeutic purpose to most of these, he told the jury. They were conducted to satisfy curiosity, nothing more. Sullivan insisted on taking the stand in his own defense. His voice was calm, his diction flawless. "I regret," he said, "that my methods are not yet understood by my peers. But regret for misunderstanding is not guilt. Every patient who entered my care did so willingly, hoping for a better life. Some achieved it, if only for a time. And those who did not, well, their contribution to science will outlive them by centuries." When Vance asked if he felt remorse for the suffering he caused, Sullivan's reply was immediate. "No. Remorse implies wrongdoing. I did what needed to be done. The gallery erupted, shouts, gasps, even sobs, but the judge's gavel brought it back to order. In that moment, Carmichael knew the jury's decision was sealed. No one who heard those words could mistake them for anything but the truth of Sullivan's nature. The trial would end, but the shadow of what he had done would never leave Milbrook. The courthouse was packed on the morning the jury returned. For 3 days, the townspeople had lingered outside in the rain and sun, waiting for the word that would either condemn or spare Dr. Cornelius Sullivan. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The jurors filed in, their faces solemn, eyes fixed straight ahead. Carmichael, seated behind the prosecution's table, could feel the tension winding through the benches like a pulled rope. When the foreman rose, the room held its breath. On the charge of murder in the first degree to 7 counts, we find the defendant guilty. The words landed like hammer blows. Sullivan did not flinch. His expression was one of detached curiosity, as though he were observing a patient's reaction to an unexpected diagnosis. The judge, a stern-faced man named Alistair Reed, turned to Sullivan. You stand convicted of crimes unparalleled in this court's history. For each life taken, the law demands justice. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to take place 90 days from today. The murmurs swelled into a wave, some voices triumphant, others trembling with grief. Catherine Dawson, seated beside Dr. Brennan, closed her eyes. Sullivan inclined his head politely, as though acknowledging a polite but inaccurate conclusion. Outside, the street was alive with clamor. Reporters ran to telegraph offices, scrawling headlines: Sullivan to hang medical butcher guilty on all COONTs. Families of the victims clung to one another, some weeping openly, others wearing grim, satisfied expressions. Samuel Turner, whose son David's preserved head had been recovered from the basement, stood at the courthouse steps. Justice, he said quietly to Carmichael. Not enough, but it's something. Back in his cell, Sullivan resumed writing. Day after day he filled page after page in a careful hand, as though preparing a textbook. Guards noticed that he often paused mid-sentence, gazing at the ceiling with the faint smile of a man lost in thought. When asked what he was working on, he replied, My memoirs. History will not remember me as you do. They will read my methods and see genius where you see crime. The warden ordered the pages reviewed before they left the jail. Even so, they contained diagrams and procedural notes that made seasoned physicians blanch. Margaret Sullivan remained under guard in the adjoining wing. Unlike her father, she wrote nothing. She sat for hours at a time, hands folded in her lap, staring through the bars as though watching something far away. When Brennan visited, she greeted him politely. Do you understand what will happen to your father? He asked. Yes, she replied without emotion. The state will terminate him. His work will stop, unless I continue it. Brennan's stomach tightened. Is that what you want? It is what he prepared me for, she said simply. The weeks before the execution brought a steady stream of visitors to Sullivan's cell, journalists seeking final interviews, physicians hoping to glimpse his records, and, in one case, a young medical student who claimed to admire his bravery. Carmichael intercepted most of them. If you want to learn from this man, he told one persistent reporter, learn what happens when you let ambition erase your humanity. 2 nights before the hanging, Sullivan requested a meeting with the sheriff. Carmichael found him seated at his desk, pen in hand, finishing a final page. Sheriff, Sullivan began, you have done your duty. I respect that. But you should know, my work will outlive me. Others have my notes. You cannot stop what is already set in motion. Carmichael leaned forward. Then I'll hunt them like I hunted you. Sullivan smiled faintly. You won't know them. They'll smile, shake your hand, heal your children. And behind closed doors, he trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging like a scalpel over an open wound. The morning of the execution dawned gray and cold. A scaffold had been erected on the outskirts of town, away from the courthouse but close enough for the crowd to gather. By mid-morning, hundreds stood, in silence, their breath clouding in the frigid air. The condemned man emerged flanked by 2 guards, wearing the same composed expression he had worn at his sentencing. Carmichael watched from the front of the crowd as Sullivan mounted the steps. There was no tremor in his hands, no falter in his stride. The judge read the formal sentence, and the hangman stepped forward to place the hood over Sullivan's head. But before it could be drawn, the doctor spoke, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. You may kill me, he said, but you cannot kill discovery. The future will prove me right. A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. The hood came down. The rope tightened. Moments later, the trapdoor fell away. The body hung still. In the days after, The town moved quickly to erase what remained of the Sullivan Medical Institute. The building was emptied, its contents burned under guard. The fire burned with strange, acrid smoke, fed by the chemical preservatives. The smell clung to the air for hours, even after the last ember died. The site felt wrong, earth darkened, grass refusing to grow. The town council voted to declare it unfit for building. Margaret was transferred to the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane. Her condition was described in official reports as irreversible neurological modification. Physicians from across the region came to study her, some with the same cold fascination that had driven her father. Brennan visited once. She greeted him with the same flat politeness as always. "They think I'm damaged," she said. "But I am exactly as my father intended." Brennan left without answering. Carmichael returned to his duties, but the case never left him. Some nights he would walk past the fenced-off lot where the institute had stood, imagining the sound of footsteps below, the click of metal instruments, the low murmur of a voice describing progress. He had brought Sullivan to justice, but the man's final words lingered like a shadow. "Others have my notes." And Carmichael knew justice in Milbrook was only the beginning. The execution of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan did not end the matter, it ignited it. Within a week, newspapers from Louisville to Cincinnati printed editorials demanding reforms in the medical profession. The Louisville Courier called the case a wound in the public trust so deep it will take decades to heal. In Frankfort, the legislature moved with unusual speed. New bills appeared on the docket, proposing tighter oversight of private medical practices, mandatory licensing reviews, and unannounced inspections of any facility performing surgical procedures. The proposals passed almost unanimously, but the laws, Carmichael knew, were as much for show as for safety. Laws only mattered if the men who enforced them were willing to look behind. Respectable doors. Dr. Augustus Brennan was summoned to testify before the State Medical Board. His report on Sullivan's methods, accompanied by sketches and photographs from the evidence, was read aloud in a room so silent that the creak of a chair made heads turn. Brennan did not spare the board's dignity. "These atrocities were committed under the cover of your licensure," he said. "You gave him the papers that allowed him to cut into living brains without scrutiny. If you cannot prevent another Sullivan, you may as well hang a shingle that says anything goes." The chairman, a pale man with watery eyes, promised a new era of accountability. Brennan left unconvinced. Investigators kept pulling at the threads. Sullivan had left behind. Dr. Edmund Forrester in Nashville was tried and sentenced to life at hard labor. Dr. Harrison Blackstone in Louisville faced charges of involuntary manslaughter. After the deaths of multiple patients were linked to his emotional dampening procedures, some names on Sullivan's list simply vanished. Men who sold their practices overnight, packed their belongings, and disappeared into cities where no one asked questions. Others remained in place, publicly condemning Sullivan while privately burning their own records. Milbrook itself changed overnight. The once quiet town now carried a reputation it did not want. Travelers avoided it. Mothers told children not to speak Sullivan's name aloud. The lot where the institute had stood was fenced off, weeds beginning to push through the scorched ground. A wooden sign read, "Property of the town of Milbrook, trespassing forbidden," but that didn't stop the curious. Now and then, Brennan heard of boys daring each other to sneak inside at night. They came away pale, claiming to hear footsteps underground, the faint scrape of steel, or whispers that faded when they turned their heads. Carmichael, too, felt the change. Every knock at his door seemed heavier, every letter a possible report of another case in another town. One rainy evening, he received a visitor from Lexington, a young marshal named Peter Harlan, carrying a satchel of documents. "These came from a warehouse," Harlan said, sliding the papers across the desk. "Rental records, equipment orders, some in Sullivan's name, some in others, all to the same shipping address in St. Louis." Carmichael scanned the documents. The handwriting was different, but the orders were familiar: surgical saws, preserved tissue samples, and chemicals for embalming. "Another one?" he asked. "Or more than one," Harlan replied. "Could be a branch of the same tree." The revelation kept Carmichael awake for nights. If the network was larger than they thought, Sullivan's death was only the pruning of a single limb. The roots still stretched unseen. He met with Brennan in the church where the survivors still convalesced. Catherine Dawson was improving, her voice gaining strength, though she still woke from nightmares of the surgical table. "Do you think they'll ever be safe?" Carmichael asked, glancing at the rows of cots. Brennan shook his head slowly. "Safe from men like Sullivan? Only if the world stops producing them, and it won't." By autumn, Milbrook's name had become shorthand in the press for any abuse of medical power. Another Milbrook appeared in headlines describing scandals in cities hundreds of miles away. The town council tried to redirect attention by commissioning a new library and paving Main Street, but the stain remained. Children born after Sullivan's hanging grew up hearing stories of the doctor under the ground. Some laughed him off. Others swore they'd seen a man in a long coat watching from the edge of the old lot on foggy nights. Margaret Sullivan remained in the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane. Official reports noted no change in her condition. Privately, some doctors admitted they avoided her ward entirely, disturbed by the way she seemed to study them. One nurse told Brennan, "She never blinks when you're talking to her. It's like she's memorizing every word for some later use." Brennan believed it. He visited once more, bringing her a stack of medical journals. She accepted them without thanks, leafing through the pages with quick, deliberate fingers. "Why bring me these?" she asked. "To see what you'll do with them," Brennan replied. Her faint smile was answer enough. In the winter of that year, the first snow fell over Milbrook. Carmichael walked alone to the edge of the old Institute's lot, the charred ground now covered in a thin white sheet. For a moment it looked clean, again pure, untouched. But he knew better. Underneath lay the soil where chemicals had seeped, where bone dust had settled, where the weight of 89 bodies had pressed into the earth. Some ghosts, he thought, don't rise to haunt you. They stay where they died, pulling the living back to remember them. The state's new inspection laws went into effect the following spring. A committee was formed to investigate suspicious practices. Brennan was appointed as an advisor. He doubted the board's appetite for real change. "Paper rules won't stop another Sullivan," he told Carmichael. "Only people will, and most people would rather not see what's in their own basements." Still, they both agreed if the law caught even one man before he could build his own hidden operating room, it was worth the effort. That summer, word came from Missouri of a private clinic burned to the ground under unclear circumstances. The local sheriff claimed it was an accident, but among the ashes, investigators found surgical instruments identical to those ordered to the St. Louis address in Harlan's documents. Carmichael folded the report and placed it in a drawer. He didn't need to read between the lines to know the truth. The network was still alive, and it was moving. Milbrook had been the opening act. The rest of the country just hadn't caught up yet. 5 years had passed since the gallows creaked on the outskirts of Milbrook. The scaffold was long gone, but the memory of it clung to the town like the smell of burnt rope. Some people swore they had moved on. The library stood where an empty lot once marked the heart of Main Street, and children played stickball under the same sun that had shone on Sullivan's shadow. Yet in the quiet corners at the back pews of the church, at the far tables in the diner, the name still came up, always in lowered voices. For those who had survived him, the years had not been enough to put the past away. Catherine Dawson lived in a small boarding house 2 towns over. Her hair had grown long again, though she kept it brushed forward to hide the pale arcs of scars that curved along her temples. She rarely went outside without a hat. She made her living as a seamstress, working at a table by the window. The steady rhythm of needle and thread calmed her, but some mornings she would freeze mid-stitch, her hands trembling, the thimble clattering to the floor. She would close her eyes, breathing slow, waiting for the phantom sensation of cold metal against her skull to fade. Catherine had learned to speak without the hesitation that once made every sentence a climb uphill, but she still avoided certain words once Sullivan had repeated to her during the sessions. Words like defect and adjustment could drain the color from her face in an instant. Thomas Beckwith had returned to Brandenburg, though he no longer worked the mill. The roar of machinery reminded him too much of the surgical saw. Instead, he took to farming, though his fields were smaller than most, his pace slower. He walked with a slight limp, the result of nerve damage in his right leg. On damp days, the pain flared until he had to sit with a blanket across his knees. The neighbors brought him pies and conversation, but Beckwith kept to himself. He spoke at the occasional church gathering, warning others to question anyone who promised miracles. Too good to be true. They called him a doctor, he said once, his voice quiet but steady. But a doctor heals. He only took a handful of survivors lived together at the church infirmary in Milbrook. Dr. Brennan still visited weekly, though his hair had gone gray at the temples and his hands shook when he poured tea. Some residents were as they had been the day they were freed and able to walk, unable to speak, trapped in bodies that would never obey them again. Others had found partial recovery, learning to move with canes, to form halting sentences. One man, Elias Trumbull, could now read short passages from the Bible aloud. though his voice was thin and halting. He kept a marked page in Psalms. He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds. Brennan never told him that some wounds refused to bind at all. The families of the dead carried their own scars. Samuel Turner still lived in the same white house at the end of River Street, his son David's photograph above the mantel. He dusted the frame every Saturday, speaking aloud to the boy as though he could hear. Laws are tighter now, Turner said one summer evening to Carmichael, who had stopped by. They say no one else will get away with it, but I don't believe them. There's always another man willing to hide cruelty in the name of science. Carmichael didn't argue. Margaret Sullivan had vanished from public memory, or so the official story went. She remained in the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane, her ward a locked corridor where visitors were rare. The nurses said she had taken up sketching, filling pages with precise clinical diagrams of human anatomy. None were signed, but each was marked with a single letter in the corner. C. When Brennan saw them, he thought of the way her father had signed his own notes, small, deliberate, as if knowing they might one day be evidence. Carmichael himself carried the weight of the case in ways he could not have predicted. He had worked other crimes since murders of passion, robberies gone wrong, but nothing else carried the same cold precision as Sullivan's work. Some nights he woke to the sound of imagined footsteps on floorboards, his hand going automatically to the pistol by his bed. In the darkness, he could see the surgical table in his mind, the instruments laid out in perfect alignment. The nightmares were worse when he dreamed of Sullivan's final words. Others have my notes. In Louisville, Dr. Harrison Blackstone's trial had ended with a conviction. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, though Brennan suspected even behind bars. The man's mind still wandered the corridors of the brain with a scalpel in hand. Dr. Edmund Forrester in Nashville fared no better, dying in prison after a year. The official cause was pneumonia, though rumors whispered of something closer to vengeance. But other names from Sullivan's correspondence had never faced a judge. The trail had gone cold, buried under respectable clinic doors and polished reputations. By the 10th anniversary of Sullivan's death, Milbrook held a memorial for the victims. The town green was filled with rows of white markers, each bearing a name or in some cases, just the word unknown. Catherine Dawson attended, standing at the edge of the crowd. She didn't approach the markers. She couldn't bring herself to look at them closely, but when the bell tolled 89 times, she counted each one, lips moving silently. Beckwith stood further back, hat in hand. He didn't pray, he hadn't in years, but he stayed until the last bell faded. After the ceremony, Carmichael and Brennan walked together toward the river. You think we'll ever be done with him? Carmichael asked. No, Brennan said, watching the water carry away fallen leaves, but maybe we'll learn to live with the knowing. They stood there for a while, listening to the current in the distance. The church bell rang once more, not for Sullivan, but for a wedding. Life, stubborn as the river, moved forward, but for those who had survived, the past was always just a step behind. It had been more than 20 years since the rope tightened around Cornelius Sullivan's neck. For most of the country, his name was a faded headline, a story folded away in old newspaper archives. Only in Milbrook did it still feel close, like a faint vibration under the floorboards. Carmichael had retired 5 years earlier, his badge locked away in a desk drawer. His knees ached, and his hair had gone the color of ash. He kept busy with his garden, church suppers, and the occasional fishing trip with Brennan. He had almost convinced himself the past was settled. Until the letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, postmarked St. Louis. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of script taught in old boarding schools. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with only one line written in blue ink. You didn't catch all of us. There was no signature. Carmichael read it twice, then a third time. The words felt less like a threat, and more like a diagnosis. Certain, irreversible. He took it to Brennan, who read it once and handed it back. I told you, Brennan said, roots. Around the same time, reports began surfacing in medical journals, quiet, unpublicized notes about unorthodox neurological trials in private clinics. The cases were scattered. A patient in Chicago who claimed she'd been kept awake during spinal surgery. A veteran in Kansas reporting memory loss after an experimental emotional regulation procedure. Most of these reports were dismissed as either errors or but the patterns were there, if you knew how to look. Carmichael knew. In Milbrook, the old Sullivan lot had been turned into a small park. A few benches faced a bed of roses, and a plaque read, in memory of those lost to the misuse of medicine. May we remain vigilant. Children played there in the afternoons, chasing each other through the grass that had once refused to grow. The ground looked healed, but Brennan swore he could still smell chemicals when the air was damp. One evening, Catherine Dawson came to the park. She sat on a bench near the plaque, her sewing basket in her lap. "Do you ever think it could happen again?" she asked Carmichael, who had joined her. "It already has," he said quietly. The turning point came in late autumn. Brennan received a package at his home, hand-delivered by a courier who claimed not to know the sender. Inside was a stack of photocopied diagrams, surgical sketches of the human brain, annotated in precise handwriting. The drawings were disturbingly familiar, not exact copies of Sullivan's work, but close enough to be unmistakable descendants. In the corner of the first page was a small letter C. Brennan felt his stomach turn. Margaret Sullivan had not signed her work in decades. They traveled to the Kentucky State Hospital the next day. Margaret's room was empty. The head nurse said she had been transferred 6 months ago to a private facility in Missouri, though no records showed the address. She was quiet, the nurse said. Too quiet. Always watching. Always thinking. Carmichael looked at Brennan, and now she's gone. The search led them to St. Louis, where a clinic operating under the name Helios Institute had recently opened. Its glossy brochures promised breakthroughs in cognitive health and revolutionary mood stabilization techniques. Carmichael and Brennan walked past its front windows one gray afternoon. Inside, the lobby gleamed white marble floors, polished brass railings, potted palms. A receptionist smiled from behind a desk. On the wall hung a framed motto, "Progress demands courage." Neither man went inside. Instead, they spoke to a custodian from a neighboring building. "Place runs late, into the night," the man said. "Lights on in the basement all hours. Never see patients leave, only arrive." It was the kind of sentence that made Carmichael's skin prickle. They tried to raise the alarm, sending copies of the diagrams to the state medical board. The reply came weeks later, a polite letter thanking them for their concern and assuring them the Helios Institute was fully compliant with current regulations. It was the same soft language Brennan had heard after Sullivan's first victims disappeared. "They're going to let it happen again," Brennan said. "They already are," Carmichael replied. In December, another envelope arrived at Carmichael's home. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, that it showed a woman walking into the Helios Institute. Her coat collar was turned up, her hair streaked with gray, but her posture, her steady, unhurried gait, was unmistakable. Margaret Sullivan, winter, settled in hard that year. Snow covered the roses in the park, turning the plaque into a hump beneath a white drift. Carmichael began keeping a journal again, recording each rumor, each unexplained death or disappearance tied to treatment. He filled 3 notebooks before spring. Some nights he wondered if it was obsession, but on others he remembered Sullivan's words. "You won't know them. They'll smile, shake your hand, heal your children." The last entry in his latest notebook was written in early April. "Brennan says we should go in, just the 2 of us. No warrants, no waiting." "I think he's right." He closed the book and placed it in the desk drawer beside his old badge. The sound of the badge hitting the wood was like the click of a surgical instrument being set in place. In Milbrook, life continued. Children laughed. In the park, the library lent books. The river flowed on, but beneath that quiet surface, something moved, a slow, deliberate pulse, like the faint echo of footsteps in a hallway no one could see. The Sullivan name was still alive, and this time, Carmichael knew, they might not get another chance to stop it.